go on. And our next speaker is Dr. Michael Borbora. He's the Chief Medical Officer at a company called Media. And he works at a Toronto where he's got a very large practice, a family medicine practice, but it deals with cannabinoids. Cannabis treatments. And he's treated thousands of people over the last year. So he's seen many things and many good effects. So, Mike, can you please come on up?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'd like to thank Direct MS for inviting me to share my experience with you as a physician coming from Toronto and my experience prescribing cannabis to about 4,000 patients today. So just a little bit about me. I did a bachelor's degree in the University of Windsor, went on to do my master's of business administration as well at the School of Business. Completed my MD degree at Western and then went on to the University of Toronto to do family medicine. So I did as a family medicine doctor. But right about at the time I graduated, the first medical marijuana clinic opened up in Toronto. And I was completely blown away and curious as to what this was all about. I was never taught about medical cannabis in medical school. I've never met any patients that were using medical cannabis. And so my curiosity was really piqued. So I went to this clinic, and the very first patient I met was a 8-year-old boy. And I was very surprised and taken aback. And I spoke to the parents, and they told me that for the first time in that child's life, they were seizure-free with the use of something called CBD oil. And again, I was naive at the time. I didn't know what CBD oil was. But this child, since their birth, had had hundreds and hundreds of seizures every single month. And they tried 10, 15, 20 pharmaceuticals from the top neurologists, and nothing helped. And so that story was all it took for me to be infected by the potential therapeutic benefits of this plant. And since that very moment, I've committed myself to helping as many patients as I can with this plant. And so that's the primary motivation behind this. I work at the Cannabinoid Medical Clinic as well as the medical director. And I now serve as the Chief Medical Officer at Olympia Total Health, which operates the Cannabis Medical Clinics. As a physician, I just want to disclose that I do have a financial interest in the clinics that I work at and operate. I did also receive an honorarium for today's talk. Have spoken in the past as well for industry, and I have received payments for those, just for full disclosure. Today, my presentation is really based on my experience as well as the research. I want to walk you through a few patient cases today. I want to review some of the research behind cannabis. I want to show you a little bit about the consumption methods, how it can help or potentially harm people. Understand, well, what are the risks and what are the benefits of this plant? I want to walk you through really briefly the system, although the speaker after me will also talk about the cannabis system. And then I'll just give you a sense of how a clinic would work. So today we're going to meet two patients. The first patient is Benjamin, and he's a 36-year-old male. He's been dealing with MS for the last 6 years when presented with a drop foot. Essentially, his foot was not working well due to neurological disease. He's had a number of flares of his MS over the past few years, and he comes to see me and tells me that he's been dealing with neuropathic pain. That's nerve pain, numbness, tingling, and burning in different areas of his body, very common to MS patients. And he has spasticity, where his muscles get very stiff, or they get into spasms, and it causes an immense amount of pain. And also deals with insomnia. He's not sleeping well, which further contributes to his stress. He's on a number of medications, including antidepressants, muscle relaxers, nerve blocking agents. He's been on a lot of different other therapies as well as medications before to try to improve his quality of life, but he feels like he's not optimizing his health, and he's coming to see me. And his neurologist actually referred him to me, so his neurologist was very open-minded, and this was years ago. The second patient I want you to meet today is Maggie. And Maggie is a 30-year-old female with a cervical disc herniation, so a compressed disc in her neck which happened after a car accident. She has electrical shocks, burning and tingling in her left arm every day. And she tells me her quality of life has suffered. She's also now depressed and anxious because of the long-term pain of the past 3 years. And she's been on a long, long list of medications, probably over 10. Unfortunately, she cannot have surgery to fix her disc, and she's coming to me because her main issue in her 30s is that she's on opiates, and all she sees is that the dose is going higher and higher and higher, and her quality of life is not keeping up. Let's talk a little bit about cannabis. So first I want to poll the audience here and online. The endocannabinoid system. I think it's found in every organ in the body, limited to our nervous system. Is it in the deepest parts of our brain called the brain stem? Is it responsible for a fight or flight response, or do we really understand what's going on with it, clearly defined in its role? So the answer to that question is that this endocannabinoid system, the system where cannabis works on, there are receptors almost in every single cell in our body, which is a very unique thing because all the other systems in our body don't tend to have receptors throughout all the cells. So this is a very interesting feature that is unique to the cannabis system. You have to understand a little bit of the definitions prior to understanding how cannabis works. So cannabinoids work on the system in our body. Endocannabinoids, your body makes its own cannabis molecules. So when you sit here, and hopefully you're enjoying this talk, if you're enjoying it and you're feeling relaxed, and feeling smiley or euphoric, that could be your body making cannabis all on its own, making you feel relaxed. And we now know that people who go for runs, they actually produce very high levels of cannabis in their system, and hence they get that runner's high, so they feel very relaxed and calm. That is your body doing its own work, producing its own cannabis molecules. Things like yoga and meditation probably also boost your body's ability to make cannabis. And then the last two things are phytocannabinoids. Phyto just means plant. So those are cannabinoids that come from the plant. And synthetic cannabinoids are the ones that we make in a lab. So those are pharmaceutical-derived formulations that work on the body's receptors in the cannabis system. So the endocannabinoid system is extremely important. You cannot survive without this system. Even small animals and nematodes have an endocannabinoid system. So you cannot survive without this system. So we know it's extremely important. It's involved in our immune system, sleep, perception, appetite, bone development, memory, cardiovascular function, digestion, and even more. It is a huge, huge communication system. It is the only system, to my knowledge, that allows our brain and our body to communicate and regulate all of the systems in our body. In my opinion, this is the most superior regulatory system in the body. This can influence your nervous system. The cannabinoid system can influence your cardiovascular system. It can influence your endocrine system. So having a well-functioning endocannabinoid system is important for your health. The three main ingredients in the cannabis plant and the phytocannabinoids that work on those receptors in your body, in addition to your body making their own, are phytocannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids. And so we now know that the phytocannabinoids, those are the most medicinal ingredients in the plant. Out of all 500 ingredients, these 100 cannabinoids are the most medicinal. That's at least proven to date. And we really only know about THC and CBD, two main ones, but there's another 98 that we need to extract and understand and find out if they have medicinal properties as well. And then terpenes, as mentioned earlier, limonene, pinene, these are things found in fruits and vegetables. They also have medicinal effects, probably just not as potent as the other ingredients, the cannabinoids. And then flavonoids are just another layer of ingredients. So all of these ingredients come together in the plant. And you can imagine when you take all the different permutations of all of these different combinations, you can have hundreds and thousands of strains and genetics, and all of them can potentially produce different effects. So this is a very complex plant, and it's co-evolved with humans to work on a system in our body. It's very interesting. There's nothing like this. So the two most important cannabinoids, regardless of about all those different ingredients, the plant takes all that sunlight, all that energy, and decides to make THC, CBD, or a little bit of both. So it likes to decide to have either high THC and low CBD, about equal parts, CBD and THC, or it likes to have high CBD and low THC. So that's typically what the plant will do based on its genetics. THC, the simplest way to understand this is that this is the more psychoactive ingredient. It is extremely medicinal when used appropriate and when used in the proper dosages, but it is the ingredient that has the potential for recreation, to get high or stoned or forget about your day completely until you pass out and wake up the next day, or as some patients tell me, couch walk. This is what will drive people to a recreational market, and they will prefer higher potency products. But if you use this in the right dosage with proper coaching, you can get substantial medicinal benefits: muscle relaxation, reduction in anxiety, improvement in insomnia, a sense of well-being, without feeling impaired, high, stoned, any of that. It's all about the dose. And you need someone coaching you and helping you in doing this because it's quite complex. CBD, on the other hand, is the easiest way to think about that is the one that works on the body. So no matter how high the dose of the CBD is, you're not really going to feel a high or a stone or an impairment. What you should feel is a sense of calm, relaxation, hopefully a reduction in inflammation of the body, hopefully a potent anti-anxiety effect without any appearance of feeling out. And then, of course, if you combine the two, you can get a little bit of both of those benefits, and when used appropriately, you can again also avoid psychoactive effects. So when I prescribe cannabis to my patients, I always tell them, if you are feeling high or stoned, you're on too high, you need to dial it back a bit. And the approach is always to start at a very low dose and to slowly move up. These are the different terpenes. We talked about limonene, pinene, myrcene. These are all different ingredients. They add aromas to the plant, and they also have medicinal effects. So we know linalool is also in lavender, and that can be a little bit sedating and relaxing, for example. So you can combine that with CBD or THC to enhance the effects of a specific strain of cannabis. And what we've learned in medicine now, medicine's been so good at looking at nature, finding the most medicinal ingredient, extracting it, synthesizing something similar in a lab and saying, here, take this because we can prove it works, and we can patent it and sell it to you. But with the plant, the problem is a lot of our medicines come from plants, but plant medicine is so much more complicated because it's not just flicking one switch in the body or just turning on one receptor. It is a much more holistic treatment. It is really balancing turning on and turning off multiple things simultaneously. So it's much more complex to study. It's much more difficult to understand. It's actually easier science to just extract and synthesize one ingredient and then try to prove that that works or doesn't work. And what we found with cannabis is that if you try to do that, if you try to take the THC and make your own in a lab, or try to take the CBD and make your own version of CBD in a lab, you just don't get the same effects. They do have medicinal properties, and I do prescribe them for some patients when it's appropriate, but by and large, something known as the entourage effect is if you don't have all the ingredients in the plant, you're just not going to maximize the medicinal benefit. The entourage effect is the plant works best when it's around all of its other ingredients. And I think this is really starting to change our perspective on health and wellness. Now, the basic science research on cannabis is extremely exhaustive. People have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars looking into the basic science of cannabis, mostly to prevent it from becoming legal for the past number of years. But the basic science shows the medicinal properties of this plant are quite remarkable. And if I told you today that I went up in the Banff Mountains and found a plant that no one's ever discovered before, and it had anti-inflammatory, anti-algesic, bone stimulant, immunosuppressive, anti-epileptic, anti-cancer, neuroprotective, anti-proliferative, anti-emetic, antibacterial, antifungal effects, without doubt you would be saying that this is the single biggest discovery and medicinal opportunity of our lifetime. But because of the stigma that is ingrained in us, and because of the culture and the history of cannabis, the reality is that we're still struggling to get the truth out about the medicinal properties of cannabis. These are all well-proven basic scientific facts on the medicinal properties of cannabis. And what we need to do is the next step is to now take this and study it in patients in specific conditions and prove that that anti-inflammatory effect does work, and prove that the anti-epileptic effect will reduce the seizures. We know the plant has the properties, but we still need to study it in certain populations to understand what dose, what conditions, and what effect can we promise patients, what percentage of them are going to get better. When it comes to the legal system, currently, the medicinal legal system, there's 3 products. There's the flower. People inhale that usually through vaporizing. There's the oils, which you can ingest, and you can measure that with a syringe. And there's also capsules. Other products will be creams, inhalers, patches. All of these will be coming out, I anticipate, in the next year or 2. And this will be the medicinal cannabis products. If anybody is taking any product that is not an oil, a flower, or a capsule, it's not legally sourced. And that's important because a lot of people get confused because there's different regulations here in Canada, and some places are allowed to operate despite being technically illegal and unregulated. And so we don't know what's in the cannabis in some of these products. Okay? Health Canada is not keeping an eye on some of those illicit ones. In the legal market, they are keeping an eye on these things, and they test for pesticides and heavy metals and antifungals and bacteria, and the quality can be assured. The synthetic cannabinoids, there's 2. It's called nabilone and nabiximol. So your pharmacy probably carries these 2 pharmaceutical products, and they have cannabis ingredients in it. But the reality is we talked about that entourage effect. So nabilone is just a THC analog. It just looks like THC, but it has none of the other 500 ingredients. So it tends to have more side effects. People tend to feel a little groggy on it. They tend to have worsening dry mouth, in my experience, than the plant. Biximol, which is Sativex, is a spray, and this is actually approved specifically for MS spasticity, and it's been on the market for a number of years, but it's like $1,000 a month, and very few people tend to cover it. There are some insurance plans that cover it, but in the legal cannabis licensed producer market, I can replicate this product for like $100 a month. So there's a huge financial incentive for most patients to use a Canadian licensed producer over this pharmaceutical because it's almost identical. Now, the cannabinoid system works really, we talked about how it's in almost every cell in the body, but there's 2 huge areas that for whatever reason, these receptors are extremely dense. And 1 is the brain, and 2 is the immune system. And while I can't say we fully understand what's going on with the immune system, this is going to be a huge, huge target for the next 10 years. And I anticipate we'll come out with a number of different pharmaceutical therapies or plant-based therapies on the immune system for autoimmune conditions potentially, cancers potentially. We don't know. We have to research this. And then the other area where the receptors are in the brain. And so obviously the brain and the body are a lot more complex than I think we really understand. And I think treating the whole person is really where the future of medicine and wellness is coming in. So the important thing about the brain is that there are no receptors, so there's no cannabinoid receptors in a very important part of your brain called the brainstem. And that brainstem is responsible for your ability to breathe. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not an area I would like to prescribe a medicine to alter. But so many patients are still on opioids and benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety or sometimes used for sleeping. and they work on that area of your brain. And that's why we have 4,000 overdose deaths a year in Canada. That's why there's 25,000 US deaths a year from opiates. It's because these drugs mess with a very important part of our brain that I just don't think we should be going close to. And cannabis, what's nice about it, while it does work on the brain, it doesn't touch this area. It's impossible to overdose on cannabis because there is no receptors in that critical part of our brain. And so if you're a physician that believes in first do no harm, you should always be using cannabis before you use a drug that works on that part of the brain. Okay. This is a very complicated slide, but just want to illustrate that in the immune system we know that cannabinoids block inflammation. So the immune system is responsible for inflammation, and we are learning more and more multiple diseases are related to inflammation. We used to think heart attacks were related to just cholesterol and plaques, and now we're finding out that yes, it's cholesterol and plaques, but it's actually the inflammation around that that is what's causing the problem. And we're learning more and more diseases are a chronic state of inflammation. And so the cannabinoid system is a place that we could target to help reduce inflammation. And then in the brain, the other receptor that was called, there's a 1 and a 2 receptor, CB1 and CB2. What it does in the brain is it tells the brain, relax, it's okay, you don't have to send out so many pain signals, you don't have to send out so many anxiety signals, everything is going to be okay. That's what's happening on a scientific level that the patient would experience. Now when it comes to the research and evidence, you'll find that there's lots of claims for cannabis. But I want to poll the audience here. I just want to get you to think about what do you think the research shows and doesn't show. So out of all of these 5 options, which one does not have good evidence in terms of research? Is it MS spasticity? Is it nausea, vomiting, and chemotherapy? Is it anxiety and depression? Is it chronic neuropathic pain? Or is it opioid-sparing effects? So you'll see claims that cannabis can help with all of them, and there are patients that are definitely using cannabis to help with all of them. But if you look at the medical literature, the reality is we still need the most research when it comes to anxiety and depression. So while it does work for many, many patients, and I have hundreds and thousands of patients that are getting anti-anxiety and they're getting antidepressive effects from cannabis, research still needs to keep catch up with that the most. The other ones have much more robust research to prove. Now, with cannabis, there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of problems with this evidence. And so, as physicians, we always strive for science to back up any clinical decisions we pass on to patients. We want the most amount of information so you can make an informed choice. But there's so many problems when it comes to cannabis that we have to pause and say, well, why don't we have the right research? And where do we need to go? So first is there's access bias. Unfortunately, scientists in the States cannot study cannabis because it's labeled a Schedule 1 drug. That puts it on the same level as heroin. It makes no sense. One of them can kill you, one of them cannot. They should not be classified the same, but this is unfortunately politics. So when a drug is classified as level 1, you cannot study it. The only people that can study it are the Drug Enforcement Agency, okay, whose primary motive is to enforce drug policy and maintain status quo. So it's a huge conflict of interest. The second issue with research is that there's bias. So if you wanted to study cannabis the last 40, 50 years, you would get approved if your study was looking at something negative. If you wanted to prove that cannabis helped with inflammation, if you wanted to prove cannabis helped with pain, the odds of you getting funding were dramatically lower. So if you look at the research, the primary goal of 90% of the research is to prove it doesn't work. So if you only look for negative outcomes, you will only find negative outcomes. So we're now on the verge of something new and exciting, and I hope the next 10 or 20 years will be 90% will only look at the benefits, because we've been trying to study this for many years and looking at the harms. But that's a bias. So that affects what we know and what we don't know. A lot of studies are done on recreational users, so you can't necessarily say medical users are the same as recreational users. They don't use the same strains, they don't use the same products, their goals are not the same. So you can't take the data that's on people who want to get high and stone and say, well, this is why it doesn't work in medical patients. They're two different populations. And then the last thing is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is this thing in society where, we have a fixed belief, and when, despite us being confronted with new research, new evidence, we still stick to that belief because we've been told for many years, this is a drug, this is toxic, this is bad for you. You know, it's banned, you're not allowed, you know, only certain people use it. It's got a slang term, marijuana, that, you know, is slang for an immigrant type of harsh term. So when you look back, you know, your brain has been programmed to look at cannabis through a certain lens, and you have to pause and just take a step back and say, well, maybe I should make my own informed decision and kind of take in all the information, all the new information, and formulate my own opinion. So this is what's called confirmation bias. And there's many physicians that still have a strong confirmation bias, no matter what study I show them. They're always going to believe till the day that they die that cannabis is bad. So we always have to be open-minded. We always have to be willing to move our opinions as new research and evidence comes to light. What we know is only this much in a circle of this much. That's the reality. And the interesting thing is, despite the fact that we talked about how it's a Schedule I drug in the United States, if you look at some of the patents on the plant ingredients, the United States government has a patent on the healing properties of the cannabis ingredients for your brain, for Parkinson's, for MS, for HIV dementia, Alzheimer's. So they're saying, on one hand, that it's a bad drug, don't use it, it's just as bad as heroin. On the other hand, well, it might have a lot of really good properties for your brain, and so we're going to patent it. So that's it's complete nonsense. It makes no sense. The best research out there is this study. It's called the National Academies Press. It's a 400-page document. It's available online for free. And the first 20 pages is just an executive summary. And this goes through all of the research to date and really summarizes what we know, what we don't know, where the research supports it, where the research doesn't support it. And these are experts in clinicians and scientists. And so here's the conclusion. The reality is that we know confidently that cannabis can help with a few conditions. It's been proven. And that is that patients who have chronic pain can have a reduction in their pain symptoms compared to people who are on a placebo or a control. We know that with cannabis. We know that patients with multiple sclerosis-related spasticity, short-term use of cannabis will improve spasticity symptoms. We know this. And we have drugs approved for this, pharmaceuticals approved for this that are cannabinoids. We know that in adults with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, oral cannabis is effective at alleviating symptoms. That's been proven. What we don't know is what strains, what doses, and the other conditions that patients claim to use it for. The only other thing I would add to this, that's newer research since this is published, is epilepsy. So we now know that CBD, a specific ingredient in the plant, can help certain types of children with very rare and debilitating seizure disorders. That's now come to light in the last year or so. Now, if you look at the negatives and some of the harms of cannabis, smoking cannabis in theory should cause toxicity in terms of inflammation in the lung. So if you heat anything past 400 degrees, you will create carcinogens. So I never recommend patients smoke cannabis. The data hasn't yet shown that, but I think it's just a matter of time and it's just common sense. We do know that if you smoke cannabis, your risk of chest infections does increase. So I never recommend patients smoke cannabis. There's a much safer alternative, vaporizing, which does not heat it so high, and you still get the same effects as if you were smoking it, but there's no risks or harms. We know that if you smoke cannabis and you're pregnant, there are children that are sometimes born with a lower birth weight. And we don't understand why that is, and we don't know if it's because the population we're looking at might have already other medical problems to begin with. But for now, it's recommended that if you're pregnant that you don't use this until there's more data. When it comes to adolescents use, we do know that the endocannabinoid system is developing in a young brain up until 25. And there is some data that says if you are young and developing brain, you could have worsening outcomes in anxiety or depression later in life. This data has been controversial. It's been challenged a lot because some of the research in younger brains was conducted while patients still had the THC in their system. And if you wait enough time that the THC gets out of the system, the effects that they were measuring actually disappear. So it's still a controversial area, but until we have more data, it's important that under the age of 25, you do not use THC-based products until we fully understand it. And then we do know that cannabis is associated with psychosis. So it does not cause schizophrenia, but some people who have certain genetic predisposition are at higher risk. So people with a brother, a sister, or a family member who have schizophrenia, or if they've hallucinated before, THC could be contraindicated for them. So they have to be very careful. So when I'm seeing my patients, I'm conducting my consultations and I'm understanding what their overall risks are, and I'm weighing that in addition to the benefits. Okay? No medicine comes without any harms, and that's important to recognize, whether it's a plant or whether it's a pill. They all have potential for side effects. When we look at cannabis and MS, some of the data shows that 2 out of every 3 patients with MS are using cannabis. There was a big systematic review collection of studies together of randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard in medicine in terms of research. And they showed that at least 30% reduction in nerve pain is achieved with medical cannabis. They also found that there's an improvement in spasticity, and that there were secondary benefits of improvement in fatigue, mobility changes, and sleep improvements. And they also found in some of these research studies that the reliance on other drugs, such as opioids, benzodiazepines, and antidepressants, decreased. And we now know in animal studies that cannabis can have neuroprotective effects as well as modulating the immune system. When it comes to MS specifically, MS is an autoimmune disease, and essentially what happens is the body attacks the important myelin sheath on our nerve cells. And without that myelin sheath, the electrical signals in our nervous system cannot communicate well with the body. And it leads to a host of symptoms: numbness, tingling, fatigue, pain, muscle spasms, disabilities, walking difficulty. It's an extremely debilitating condition for some. And there's obviously various different versions of it in terms of its severity. So it's a disease of a spectrum. So you can be on the mild spectrum, medium, or very high or extreme. So the reality is that cannabinoids potentially play a role in alleviating many of these symptoms. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section, which is understanding the different consumption methods. So there's a lot of different methods that patients were using cannabis prior to the government deciding to regulate this a little bit better and make it a little bit more accessible, because the courts forced the government to do this. But the 2 main ways that patients use cannabis are inhaling, which is vaporizing, and the other one is ingesting through a cannabis oil or a capsule. Okay, but some people call that an edible. Smoking is not recommended. Sublingual tinctures are potentially a way of delivering, but it's not a regulated product yet. Topicals patients can make their own topicals, so they can use a rub. But again, this is not a product that's commonly found in the market. It's definitely coming. And then there is some people who are juicing the raw leaves of their plants, but there's very limited research on that, and no one's really offering it as a product. So the 2 ways that you get cannabis in your body are either inhaling it, or you ingest it and eat it like a traditional medicine. So the lungs and the gut are the 2 systems that we choose to deliver this medicine. When you inhale cannabis, it works extremely fast, as little as 5 to 10 minutes, and it can last about 2 to 3 hours. And this is a very effective way to deliver a rapid dose of a medication. If there's ever a way to deliver any medicine very rapidly, the lungs is a highly effective system to choose. It goes right into your lungs and it goes directly to your bloodstream. It does not get modified by any organ, and it has its medicinal effect right away. And if you look at inhaling, smoking, and vaporizing, we talked earlier about the temperatures. So that's really important, because once you pass the 400 degrees, that's when you get toxic byproducts. So using the flame goes way past 400 degrees Fahrenheit. It goes up to 2000. Smoking also wastes half the medicine, whereas vaporizing protects the medicine because it's in a closed device. Vaporizing and smoking both are absorbed rather rapidly. What's nice about vaporizing is there's no toxic byproducts. It's efficient. There's not as much odor. I despise the smell of smoked cannabis, but vaporizing is tolerable because you don't smell it as much. It's a substantial fraction of that. So there's no real benefits to smoking over vaporizing. There's no economic benefits because it actually, hurts your wallet more. There's no health benefits. There's no proven medicinal changes in the two. So there's really no reason to smoke cannabis, especially if you're a medical user. And then different cannabis ingredients. We talked about there's 100 different cannabinoids, and THC, CBT, CBD are the most popular ones. But there's hundreds of them, and they all come off at different temperatures. So it's important that the machine, sometimes people will say, oh, it's not working, Doc, what's going on? And they look at the machine and it's not programmed to go high enough in the temperature, so they're not getting the medicinal ingredients. So there's a little bit of nuances, and hence why there's a little bit of coaching that comes to using cannabis. It's not your traditional medicine, it's not as easy. You need some help. When you look at ingestion, what happens when you ingest cannabis is it has to go through your stomach, your liver, and it gets converted from one ingredient to the other. It undergoes all of these chemical reactions, and it produces a different ingredient. So it's not the same ingredients that went into your body, it's actually a different one. And if it's the THC one, it's a little bit more potent in terms of its psychoactive effects. And that's why I use very, very small amounts when I start with patients, as small as possible. What's different with ingestion is that it takes an hour, sometimes maybe 2 hours, to start to appreciate the medicinal benefits. And it's affected by what you ate, what your experience with cannabis is, how much you took, if you took it with fats, because it's a fat-soluble medicine. So there's a lot of these little variables that can kind of adjust the way that you perceive the effects. So it's important to always start low and go slow. And once you find the right dose, though, you'll consistently be able to get it to kick in within an hour or two and last 5 to 8 hours. And if you look, this is just a graph showing you, the time and how much is in your bloodstream if we were to measure it. And so if you inhale it, the red line just shows a lot of it gets in your bloodstream really fast. And if you ingest it, if you eat it, it gets into your bloodstream, but it's a little bit slower, but it's over a much longer period of time. So it stays in your bloodstream longer. Now, when you look at the benefits and risks of cannabis, in medicine we use this nomenclature or this terminology called the therapeutic index. And that is just how big is the window of safety. And the higher the ratio, the wider the range of safety. So if you take a medicine like cannabis, your safety window is 1,000. That means you can take 1,000 times more than you were supposed to, and it's still not going to produce a toxic effect. Okay, and you can compare that to other drugs like alcohol. If you take 10 times more, you can have a toxic effect, neurotoxicity, seizures, death, coma. So it's impossible to have an overdose on cannabis. There's not even really receptors in the brain to suppress your drive to breathe. So that's really important to know, because when you put this into perspective, when you use other pharmaceuticals, the reality is if you take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times the dose by accident, or you mix it with a little bit of alcohol, or you took another drug with the interactions, there is a risk of harm, death, potentially. With cannabis, that risk is eliminated. And when you look at dependence, any drug that makes you feel good and makes you feel good fast has a risk of dependence. Okay? Caffeine, for example, has a risk of dependence. The reality is about 1 in 10 people will become dependent on cannabis. And that means that they can't function without it, but it actually causes problems for them. Okay? It's okay if you use cannabis every day and you're having functional improvements in your quality of life and your day in and day out. That's not a dependent disorder. A dependent disorder is when you're using a substance every day and it's harming you and your life and your family and your loved ones, and you continue to use it because of its addictive nature. The odds of that with cannabis are about 1 in 10. In my practice, I would say it's a little bit less than that in my experience. It's probably 5 in 100 or 1 in 20. And that may just be because that's medical patients compared to recreational users. But look at heroin. Heroin is 1 in 5. Oxycodone, Percocet, fentanyl, Tylenol-3, that is plant heroin in a pill. Okay? The odds of dependence are substantially higher. And there are many, many patients who continue to use opiates, and it's not helping them, and they know it's not helping them, they know it's hurting them, but they stay on them every day. And a lot of it is a fear of withdrawal, a fear of worsening pain, and I empathize with the difficulty many patients have with it. But to date, I've been fortunate enough to probably get close to 100 patients completely off of their opioids by substituting with cannabis. And I've never had a single patient once tell me they were disappointed from coming off their opiates. I have a 100% success rate saying that the quality of life has improved. When you look at the dependence potential of those drugs that we talked about, and we look at the safety ratio, This graph just shows us if you are on the far right of this graph, it's a safer medicine or drug, and if you're on the bottom of it, it's also safer. So cannabis, when you plot these two different features of it, it's a lot safer than many other options, and the dependence potential is much lower. And again, if you look at morphine up there, it's much higher dependence potential, and the safety ratio is much less. So you have to look at all of these factors when making informed clinical decisions about your care. When you look at the side effects, there's common side effects, less common, and rare. And the most common side effects I see are a little bit of drowsiness, a little bit of dizziness, dry mouth, sometimes your heart can race. And all of those side effects just come from the THC. They don't tend to come from the CBD. CBD tends to be very well tolerated. Very few people complain about it in terms of side effects. Sometimes at a high dose, some people feel a little bit tired on the CBD. But other than that, out of 100 patients, 1 or 2 patients will really complain about potential side effects with CBD. THC, on the other hand, if you use too much, the risk of side effects start to increase. Less common side effects, so if you use too much, you can actually have some nausea or vomiting. You can get paranoid or anxious. So you hear lots of people say, oh, I can't use cannabis, I smoked it and I became paranoid or anxious. Well, you probably used too much and you probably used the wrong strain of cannabis. It had too much THC, it had no CBD. And so this is why people experience it. It doesn't mean that they can't use cannabis, it's just they weren't using the right product. It's a whole different medicine. You do get mild amnesia when you use THC, but you can imagine how therapeutic that is to a Iraq war veteran who can't turn off their brain at night because of the memory of their colleague being traumatized by a roadside bomb. So you can imagine leveraging what some people would call a side effect as a benefit for some patients for medicinal effects. There are rare side effects, so hallucination, psychosis, delusions, and these are people with a predisposition. They should not use THC. There is a population that cannot use cannabis. And the reality is it will make their illnesses worse. It's just extremely rare. The odds of it is 1 in 23,000. There is a rare disorder called hyperemesis syndrome, and I've seen this 1 in 4,000 patients, where for whatever reason they use cannabis regularly and then they start having nausea and vomiting. And for whatever reason, something's triggered their genetics or their body, and they have to stop cannabis because they really have this cyclical vomiting. And it's really sad, because a lot of times it's really helping them, but it's a rare thing, and I've only seen it 1 out of 4,000. And it's mostly found in recreational users who use very, very potent products and use it for a very, very long time, and it tends to be smoking. And then there is some concern under the age of 25 using it in heavy concentrations of recreational users, what it does to mental health long term. So again, that's a population that we have to be careful with, that we have to steer away from THC until we have a better, clear understanding of the long-term effects. The reality is cannabis comes at a really important time for us as a society. The reality is drug policies haven't worked well. Arresting people for drug addiction isn't getting at the root cause of problems. And so there's a big push and a big movement for harm reduction strategies. And I take ownership of trying to reduce the harm that patients cause to themselves by using less harmful options. At least that's a step in the right direction. It's nudging patients or recreational people into the right direction. So when you look at cannabis, whether it's medical or recreational, harm reduction is part of the conversation often. So we know that opiates have created North American epidemic. We know that they're overprescribed. We know that anti-anxiety pills or benzodiazepines, both of those together are not recommended, and they can increase the risk of that. And the reality is we talk about heroin addicts, and a lot of people have certain perceptions of a heroin addict, but the reality is that their addiction started with a prescription. There's 22,000 deaths last year just in the United States from synthetic opiates. And we now know that there are studies that show that people who use cannabis substitute for alcohol, prescription drugs, tobacco, and illicit drugs. People with pain, mental health will choose cannabis instead of these other more harmful substances. And fortunately, in legal states now with medical cannabis laws, they're starting to show a 25% reduction in opiate overdose. Just by having access, people are not dying as much. So this is solving a much bigger public health crisis. I'm going to glance over this because this is going to be spoken at next. And I just want to talk briefly about a clinic that can see you. You should never be charged as a patient to see a clinic. You should always be educated on using the right product. Your physician that's treating you, or your family doctor, your specialist, should always be included in that discussion. And it's important that you get proper advice if you're looking at this as a medical option. I don't think self-medicating is the right idea. If you're looking at cannabis as an option, you should always get a medical expert's help. And so the Cannabis Medical Clinic is where I work, and there is one here in Calgary, and there's also one in Edmonton. And we do treat a number of patients, and we do get involved with research as well. And so you can easily be referred or contact that clinic if you ever have questions or ever want to be seen. And then the last thing is I just want to show a video of our patient, veteran. So this is our gentleman with MS who dealt with neuropathic pain, and sleep problems. He came to see me and felt like he was getting substantially better, and I actually just want you to meet him here today. So we can start the video.
My name is Vedran Peružić. I'm 35 years old. I've been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis last October 26th actually, so it'll be a year soon. I live with my family right now. I was forced to stop working because of MS. My MS causes me mostly physical symptoms. Majority of the symptoms are in my gait. I lost my ability to walk, straight line. I lost my balance. I lost everything that revolved around that. I get muscle spasticity. I get fatigue. I lost the ability to just basically walk out of my house with safety. The first time I had cannabis after getting diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I had physical and psychological symptoms that I had to deal with. On the physical side, like I said, I was dealing with muscle spasticity and with the overall question if I'm going to get a relapse or not. I noticed that when I don't use cannabis, I have much greater spasticity in my legs, and which caused me more trouble when I'm walking. It doesn't impact my life the way you would think. I can still function normally, I can still do the things that I was doing, even better sometimes. Because of this lack of stress and lack of anxiety. Because, it helps me deal with that. So yeah, in that sense, it does help. So ever since June, end of June, I've been vaporizing, dry cannabis, which is better. It's not as damaging as smoking would be. I'm able to be more positive, more optimistic, more enjoyable to be around. I'm just able to be more pleasant. And I hate to say it, but without that, or without anything, or just as it is, it's hard. I take two types of oils. One oil is pure CBD, the other oil is half THC, half CBD. The half THC CBD oil I take from muscle spasms, spasticity, and it allows me to use my legs a lot easier. The half oil, half CBD, half THC, I use for anti-inflammatory reasons. I'm not in any kind of denial, and I'm not trying to substitute medicinal marijuana with regular medicine. And that is not my goal. I've never tried to do that in my life. And I still use the same medications I did before I started using medicinal marijuana. I'm very happy to be able to have this option. This particular clinic requires a referral from a family physician, and I found that. Even though I didn't have to do this, there are places, but I still feel I want to go through my family doctor because I want her to be aware of what's going on. If you're thinking of medicinal marijuana, the best way to do it is to go through your doctor and through a clinic. If I can give my advice to other MS patients, I will not tell you do this or do that. I will tell you explore. Explore, give yourself the option and the choice to explore. Because the last thing you want to do is you want to hate yourself for not doing something.
So that pretty much concludes my presentation for today, and hopefully you found it very informative. Thank you for listening.
Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Jonathan Zay. He's the Director of Advocacy and Corporate Social Responsibility at Aurora Cannabis Incorporated. And importantly, he founded Canada's patient advocacy organization, Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. So that's really important. He's done a lot for us. So, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Ashton and Direct MS, for having me here. And it's great to be here. I love presenting to other patients because I'm a patient myself, and that's how I got into this space. When I was 14 years old, over 10 years ago now, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition called new daily persistent headache that causes 24/7 constant headaches, migraines, and insomnia. And I tried all the pharmaceutical options available. Tried going to the US to the top neurological treatment center, really everything available to me before finally turning to medical cannabis and finding tremendous relief from it, but really struggling with issues around access, affordability, and being able to incorporate it into my medical regime because at the time my physicians weren't supportive of its use. Finally, I convinced them and got a prescription and then really turned things around. So I went from being at home, an exciting activity at that time was going out to the grocery store maybe, had no quality of life, essentially dropped out of school. And then medical cannabis came around. The first time I tried it, I slept for the first time in over 5 years through the night. And from there, I was able to graduate high school, go to university, and do really well there thanks to medical cannabis. But I knew one thing wasn't right, and that was that medical cannabis wasn't covered under insurance coverage. I had been on pretty much every other medication you can imagine, from opioids to very expensive migraine drugs that were over $20 a pill. Every single one was covered, no questions asked, with no research in the condition that I have, yet medical cannabis wasn't covered, and everyone just said no right away. So I began a process of advocating for coverage and set the first insurance precedent for medical cannabis to be covered under a private benefits plan at the University of Waterloo. So that's how I got into this space. So it's really great to be here tonight to share some of my experience and to hear from you and to help you through this process as some of you may be beginning it or may be going through it and have already using cannabis and have some more questions. So I'll talk a little bit about Aurora as a company, the medical cannabis history in Canada, legalization, tax, accessing medical cannabis, which I'm sure many of you have questions about, and insurance coverage. So who are we? Aurora is a community-minded Canadian company. We are one of Canada's top cannabis companies with brands including our own Aurora, CanniMed, MedRelief, Anandia, which is a science company, and CannabisRx and Canadian Cannabis Clinics, which are a chain of educational and clinic services. Beyond that, we have a commitment to medical cannabis patients and corporate social responsibility, which is my role. And what this means is patients can be sure they have consistent supply and quality assurance. We're advocating on behalf of patients, and we're doing a lot of research in this area as well. We have the second highest square footage out of any producer in Canada, and we're a global company as well, with production across Canada and in Europe as well. Beyond that, we have a mobile app and a number of other different ways to order via online and with our client care center, which is what most licensed producers do, and I'll explain a bit more about this process of ordering soon. So a little bit about the history of medical cannabis. It hasn't been a short one or an easy one for the advocates and activists that have led us to this point, and for that we salute them and thank them. But I think it's important to understand that it hasn't been through the normal regulatory process of medicines. And I'm not going to go through all these court cases listed here, and it's really small. I'm sure that it's hard for you to read that. But starting in 2000, patients begun court challenges or were getting arrested for possessing cannabis for their medical use. And at almost every time, patients won in court. And in 2001, the first medical cannabis regime came into effect in Canada, the MMAR, which allowed patients to either order limited supply from Health Canada or grow at home. And this lasted quite some time until 2013 when the government, the Conservative government, brought in the new system, the MMPR, which was the establishment of the medical cannabis industry as we know it today, of private businesses operating as cannabis production companies. Beyond that, there's been a number of more recent changes. The ACMPR was introduced after more court challenges and reintroduced home growing personal production as an option. And from there was also the Smith case, which allowed patients to access more forms than just dried cannabis and access oils and some of the other forms Dr. Verbor was talking about. And then, of course, some of you may have heard we're just about to legalize cannabis for consumer use, and this will bring some changes to patients as well, which I'll talk about. So, as I said, the legacy has been driven by courts. The introduction of the medical cannabis market has led to this industry as we know it today, which has had a lot of positive effects in terms of research and development and bringing supply to where it is as well, of course. But the federal government needs to maintain this, especially from the patient perspective, and that's why we, as a company, have committed to supplying our patients first. And personal cultivation will remain an option as well, leading into the future. So what does legalization mean as a whole? It really doesn't mean too much. Right now, medical cannabis is legal. So if you're a patient or you're a patient considering accessing it post-legalization, the system will be largely the same as it is today for patients, and it will be distinct from the non-medical cannabis system. But there are some important changes that you should know about. One is there are new taxes coming into effect, excise taxes on medical cannabis. This is something that both myself personally and as a company we've been very passionate about advocating against. No other medication has any tax on its sales or excise tax, yet medical cannabis will be subject to both. So we've been very strong advocates against this tax. Beyond that, there'll be some packaging and labeling changes. Patients will be able to switch producers by themselves. There'll be limited possession restrictions compared to now, but there will be some more restrictions on places of use. So this is important because medical cannabis patients will have a broader ability to use cannabis in public than people without medical authorization. And in Alberta, for example, that is, from my understanding, parallel to the tobacco smoking legislation versus the cannabis consumption rules may be a bit more restrictive, but it also depends on the municipality itself and what province you're in. So there is some due diligence on patients' part to ensure you understand what the restrictions are depending on where you are. So if you also feel passionately about advocating against tax on medical cannabis, you can visit don'ttaxmedicine.ca, but the best thing to do is talk to your elected officials. Make a phone meeting, a 10-minute phone meeting, go into their office and speak to them. There's still a lot of pressure on the government to change this, and there's still time to make it happen. So I really encourage everyone to do this and speak up and make a difference. This is a really important issue, as affordability is such a struggle for so many patients, unfortunately. So a little bit about the current regulations to give you a broader understanding of what they are. The ACMPR is what governs medical cannabis, but this will change moving into the Cannabis Act, moving into legalization. This acronym won't be the same. Under the ACMPR, though, patients can access fresh cannabis, although no producers, from my understanding, supply this. It's not really something patients are looking for. Patients can buy dried cannabis, capsules, cannabis oil, and starting materials such as clones and seeds to be able to grow your own plants. And also, some producers do have cream-based products, except we can't legally mix them together yet. So they'll sell an oil separately from a cream base, and you can mix it together and do that yourself. So the only two ways of legally accessing medical cannabis are through a licensed producer, and this is through the mail. You order online or on the phone or an app. And beyond that is registering with Health Canada to produce your own medicine or to designate someone else to produce it for you. So if you're interested in accessing medical cannabis, there's a few basic steps. One, talk to your doctor. As Dr. Verbor said, I also agree it's a good first step to talk to your family physician or those specialists that are involved in your care the most. And if they're not comfortable authorizing medical cannabis and they're not feel educated in its use, then certainly ask for a referral to a specialized medical cannabis clinic. The next step is receiving authorization, whether it's from a clinic or not, and registering with a licensed producer. This step is pretty easy. Many clinics will assist you in this process, and most licensed producers, including ourselves at Aurora and our subsidiaries, have information on our websites to be able to make this process as easy as possible, and our client care team is always happy to help. Beyond that, as soon as that happens, it's sometimes a bit of a delay, just depending on how your paperwork is verified. You can order online. It's kind of like shopping on Amazon or other websites. It's pretty easy by phone or by app. And then you receive your medicine through the Canada Post or courier. So it comes right to your home. Depending on where you are, can be as quick as same-day delivery up until a few days typically. Not generally more than that, but if you live in rural areas, it can be. And certainly one of the most important things is affordability. And traditionally with medicines, they're covered. And it's not really a struggle that most people go through if they're on benefits plans or you have public coverage. Certainly there are some medicines that aren't covered and people don't all have coverage. But for the majority of Canadians, there is some level of coverage at least. But with medical cannabis, almost no patients get coverage. It's actually quite a troublesome issue, but we have seen a lot of progress. Unfortunately, for those on public coverage plans, there's very limited coverage, and I really think that unfortunately, even though people on public coverage plans who are on welfare or with limited incomes often need coverage the most, these plans will most likely be the last to cover medical cannabis due to the really stringent policies they have. With private coverage, it's a whole different story. Every insurer in Canada has made at least one exception, and that's an important thing to remember. It has been done before, so when you hear no, that doesn't mean no for good necessarily. That means, generally speaking, that medical cannabis currently is not covered under your plan, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because advocacy is about changing that. So if you hear a no, don't let that stop you, and I'll explain the process to advocate for coverage a little bit too. Public plans do cover some vaporizers in some instances, so that's another question to ask. And with private coverage, there are a few different types of plans that it's important to understand the distinctions between to be able to get coverage and to be able to advocate successfully. The first type is health spending accounts. These aren't very common, but they are increasingly utilized by typically larger scale employers. They're limited amounts of coverage between $200 and $2,000 annually, and they are typically used for things like medical expenses that aren't covered. So they're not used for drugs most commonly. They're used for paramedical services or other medical devices or things like that that aren't covered under traditional health benefits. However, the way that most plans have been set up is to assess these claims based on CRA eligible medical deductions, and medical cannabis purchased through a licensed producer is a CRA eligible medical deduction. So if you have a health spending account, you can generally claim medical cannabis through it without any questions. It's pretty easy. The only unfortunate thing is that it's quite limited in coverage. The next big group of people that have coverage are employer or union benefit plans or their dependents. And these types of plans have the most flexibility, especially ones for large-scale unions and employers where they're self-administered. So you can ask your union and employer some questions and see what kind of plan they have. But if it is self-administered or administrative services only, those two terms refers to the union or the employer, what's known as the plan sponsor, being able to administer the claims themselves. So they almost have complete control over what's covered or not because of that, not the insurer, because they're not taking on the risk. So that's going to be really key to the advocacy process as well. And these people have gotten some exceptions. There's a number of major employers that have done this, major unions. Certainly us as a company covers medical cannabis under our traditional drug benefits plan, as we see that as something that's important. But other more conservative employers are moving in that direction as well. And then if you purchase individual plans from an insurer, so just go to an insurer and get coverage for yourself. This is also very difficult to get coverage on, unfortunately, just because the risk is fully bear by the insurers, and they aren't necessarily willing to move too much on that. So in terms of the advocacy steps, the first is to understand the plan. Every plan is unique. There are very few that are the same. So you have to do a little bit of information gathering to see what you have. If you have benefits coverage and it's administered by the union and plan or employer, the plan sponsor themselves, then that's great, and you can go directly to them. So that's the really important thing to understand. Go directly to the plan sponsor. The insurer is the gatekeeper, but if medical cannabis isn't covered, they're going to tell you no, it's not covered. They're not going to tell you how to actually get it covered. But how to get it covered is you go to the plan sponsor. They're the decision maker. They set up the contract and the policy on a regular basis. So they're the ones that you can go to and request an accommodation on the basis of disability. They'll ask for documentation, often some medical history or some other similar documentation as part of this process. And it's not necessarily an easy process. I don't want to try to make it seem like it is, but it certainly has been successful by patients across the country. And the more we do collectively to keep pushing this conversation forward, the more it's getting easier for all of us. And then await a decision, see what happens. And there's certainly many different options from what you hear back. I think it's important to have a conversation about it, rather than just pressuring as much as possible. And what I mean by that is sometimes concerns that can be addressed will come up when you have a conversation with a plan sponsor. Often they're concerned about impairment. What are you going to do if you're high at work? But these kinds of things can be addressed quite easily. So having a conversation, trying to be collaborative and do this together, come to a place where you can get coverage in a responsible way, I think is really the best way about going about this. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. Now, can you stay here? Can I get Mike and Trevor back up here? And maybe you keep that with Mike and I can walk around if we have any questions. These three gentlemen will be most happy to give you frank answers. Anybody have any questions on, what kind of things cannabis might do for you, how to get it? Okay, we have, I'll take this one and then I'll go over there because
Thanks. Since before actually I was diagnosed with MS, I've had a sleep problem where I can go to sleep like nothing, but I'm going to wake up at 2:30 every morning. You're saying it might help sleep. Is this the sort of thing that might work for me and be able to sleep till like when I was a teenager almost the next day?
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so sleep is, first of all, a complicated problem. So my first advice is definitely see your physician first and talk about it, because sleep is often a 20-minute visit for me if you're coming to talk to me at minimum, because there's so many variables that go into sleep. Okay, so first, you need to speak to your physician, and you may or may not need a sleep study depending on your symptoms. What we do know about cannabis, though, is that it lengthens certain phases of your sleep cycle. So you go through 5 or 6 phases of sleep cycles, and phase 3 and 4 are these really important deep sleep states, and some of the research shows that it lengthens that. So there's a basic science explanation as to why cannabis would work. There's a lot of studies out there that show they don't usually check to see if, try to prove, the studies aren't designed to prove whether it helps with sleep, but when they poll all the patients in the study, they find out as a secondary outcome that 80% say, oh, my sleep was better, by the way, in addition to my MS spasticity or my cancer-related pain. So in my experience, yes, it does help many people, but with the caveat that you need to understand what the sleep problem is prior to using cannabis.
Okay, we have one over here.
Hi, I have a question for the first speaker, and this might be just clearly my lack of scientific knowledge. You talked about stressing out the female plant to derive more CBD, and I'm thinking, okay, stress isn't good for anybody. How can it be good for the plant? And can we get CBD that isn't from a stressed out plant?
So to answer your question, plants don't have an emotional response. There's different types of stress. There's heat stress, water stress, disease stress. Basically, when you stress out a plant, it will tend to want to produce seeds quicker, so it'll flower and want to basically preserve its genetics in producing a seed. So if it's facing a water stress situation, it'll basically go to flower sooner and produce seeds sooner so it can survive to the next generation. A trick to basically get higher potency cannabis is to remove the males, and when you do that, the females can't be pollinated, and when they don't get the pollen that they want to produce seeds, it stresses them out, and they try harder, so they produce a higher number and more trichomes, which results in a higher concentration of the cannabinoids we're looking for in the end.
Okay, have anything else out here? Oh, okay, I'll just...
I'm not sure who would answer this, but the insurance guy interested me most because I have tried cannabis and I'm so stringent with it because of the cost of it that I'm maybe not getting the full benefit. So then I'm interested in growing a plant. And how would you know what to do with the plant and how to actually harvest and extract the CBD stuff?
Yeah, there's a few layers to that question. So I'll start first at affordability and then production, if that's okay. With affordability, I think there's a few things that can always be done, or at least suggested. You may already be doing them. One is to ensure that you're keeping all your receipts and claiming it on your income taxes as a medical expense. Another one is using oils is typically, I find, more cost effective, and people can do certain things to stretch that use more. So you may be able to look at different ratios, for example, to see. But really, when it comes to the affordability question, it's going to depend what type of coverage you have or don't have, and from there to see what you can do. Certainly, many licensed producers have compassionate pricing as well, so we'll offer discounts on our medicine, so that's another option. And in terms of the personal production piece, that's not my area of expertise. It's not something I do myself, but there is a lot of great information out there. We also have another company called BC Northern Lights, which operates grow boxes. So these are fully enclosed, electric safety approved boxes that can grow 4 or 8 plants, and they're fully wired and everything is contained in one thing. So there's certainly solutions out there that make it a bit easier than a full, complete medical cannabis setup. But the one thing is it's not always cheaper in the end. So I would work out the full costs, especially if you're considering getting high CBD strains, extracting oil, and then testing the potency. That can be quite a costly process. So just make sure if you're getting into it, it's actually worthwhile from a cost perspective.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been good. Sounds okay to you, it doesn't to me. Anyway, thank you very kindly. I haven't seen anything in my notes that is a local Calgary cannabis association or whatever, that in fact I could have my doctor refer me to go from there, because that's where I'd seen something here to go to your doctor. And I was wondering if you fellows would provide it to our friend here, and he can email it to all of us so we all get it.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of associated with different groups, so we can maybe do that collectively and give you some options to explore. Does that work?
That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, and I can do that, but I'll also put it on my Facebook. So, you know, I'd hope you just become my friend on Facebook and you get all sorts of great information.
In your presentations, you indicated that there were a lot of people that tried cannabis and actually replaced part of their opioid use or whatever to help in their control their pain. And I think it was about a 30% reduction in the opioid use or something like that. I couldn't remember the actual numbers there that you had. Is it possible, or do you have a number of patients that have actually replaced totally pain medication like opioids or whatever with the use of cannabis oils, say higher CBD concentrations, or you know, that sort of thing, or not?
Yeah, so absolutely, yes. I've personally treated at least 100 patients that I've 100% removed their opiates. You know, there's a lot of art, relationship building, reassurance, counseling that goes into it. It's not just start the cannabis and you slowly titrate off the opiates. There's a lot of work that has to go into that relationship with the patient, because there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of unknowns. And so, yes, in my personal experience, I have done that with many patients. You know, the rule of thumb is if you've been on opiates for X years, it's going to take X amount of months to get off. So if you've been on opiates for 10 years, expect at least 10 months to get off your opiates. And the goal is to just slowly reduce it so that it's not, you're not becoming aware of a withdrawal, because that is the issue with many patients is they don't want to come off their opiates because of the withdrawal, not because it's actually helping with the pain, because you know, opiates are very good for acute pain. They're very good for end-of-life care for pain in that situation as well, but they're not good for chronic pain management. And what we do know is that over a period of time, as your body becomes resistant to opiates, they no longer work. And what it does is it creates what we call a hyperalgesia syndrome for some people, where the use of opiates is worsening the pain. So it's changing your brain chemistry. And it just takes a lot of coaching, but with the use of cannabis, it can mitigate some of the side effects during the withdrawal. It can replace the analgesic effect, the pain effect, and reduce the anxiety associated with it. We do know in the literature as well that cannabis indirectly works on the opiate receptors. So it won't work the same way as a potent opiate like an oxycodone or a Percocet will, where it binds irreversibly, but in a very convoluted way, it will subtly touch those receptors, so you get an opiate effect as well.
I guess a slight turn here. Is CBD derived from hemp equal to CBD derived from marijuana?
So there's a misconception with cannabis and hemp. They're basically both the same plant. It's like talking about apple trees. You can have Granny Smith and Red Delicious. They're both apple trees. They just have different names and produce different types of fruits. THC has been bred out of hemp, therefore it doesn't produce as much THC or a very limited amount. Basically, they've blocked the enzyme that converts cannabidiol to tetrahydrocannabinolic acid. Therefore, basically, CBG is shunted down the metabolic pathway in a different area, and most of that is converted to CBD. So that's why hemp is associated with CBD, and some of the other medical strains are more prominent in THC.
Okay. Do we have one over here? Just a second, we got one over here.
Hi, I just wanted to say first off that I'm shocked that the room isn't standing room only. I don't know where everybody is tonight, but a couple of things. I've taken CBD oil in the past for MS spasticity. Notice that it helped, but then it wasn't helping anymore. Questions are, one, it was recommended that there's been some type of studies that instead of taking the CBD oil the same amount, maybe 3 or 4 times a day, take larger dosages less often. Can you guys speak to that? And then the other thing that I wanted to ask just slipped my mind. So maybe I'll let you answer that and it'll come.
So usually with CBD, we find people can go on a steady dose and get medicinal effects. The problem is that diseases change. So, we sometimes forget that, oh, hey, you have a chronic disease, and the chronic disease itself can change, and therefore your dose can change just because of that. For example, I treat pediatric epilepsy with CBD, and my children's weight will gain. So their dose can double, can triple, can quadruple over just 3 or 4 years. Some people feel there's a little bit of tolerance that builds up. There's not a lot of good research on the tolerance of CBD and THC, and so we know that with other drugs there is potential tolerance, and then the effects wax and wane. For some of those patients, I recommend like a drug holiday. So I say, maybe we should just, take 2 weeks off, flush this out of your system, go back at a low dose and start again. And then another approach is in these scenarios is that we say, well, maybe we should shuffle the strain. So we can find another CBD strain, but maybe from a different company that has different genetics and it has different terpenes and other different cannabinoids. And let's see if we approach it from that angle, if it works. So the problem is there's so many different variables that go into it. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. But there's a small percentage of patients that do experience that. Yeah, so the question is there a benefit to pure CBD versus a whole plant extract with high CBD? And yeah, in my experience and some of the evidence, and I talked about what's called that entourage effect, when you have all the ingredients in the plant, there tends to be more medicinal benefits. So some companies, majority of companies, their extracts, to my knowledge, are full plant extracts. There are some that will just use the CBD, but in my experience and my knowledge of the science, it's the full plant extracts that work the best. But majority of the products on the licensed producer market are that. If you're using like a hemp-based CBD, there may not be perhaps any of those other ingredients.
Okay, we have one over here.
Me again, Dr. Bavora, just to ask you, one of your slides showed that for MS, taking the cannabis should be short-term. MS seems to be for life. Wondering what short-term means.
So that slide you're referring to, I believe, was just one of the studies that was conducted. So I don't, like, the studies inform us and give us a sense of what the evidence is behind the clinical decision making, but it doesn't influence the specific patient in front of me. So there's science to say that short-term use of cannabis in MS patients is beneficial. There's more science that's needed to say, well, what happens if they use it for 10 or 20 or 30 years? It just happened to be what the scientists decided to study with that specific study. So it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work or does work for the long period of time. So I would just say this is a case-by-case basis. There's just there's no good clinical evidence to say what will or what won't happen, but I think for you, if you were using cannabis, you should use it to optimize your health and see how it helps you, whether short-term or long-term. The majority of MS patients are going to use it in the long term.
Okay, that's good. Hey.
Yes, I have fibromyalgia and it's also an autoimmune. What kind of results have you had?
Yeah, so fibromyalgia is a very complicated issue. There may be immune components related to fibromyalgia, And in the literature, maybe a year or two ago, there was a study that came out by a famous cannabis expert in the States named Ethan Russo. So if you ever want to Google another expert in the States, Ethan Russo is excellent. So he did a study, and he showed that people with fibromyalgia, migraines, and irritable bowel syndrome had lower levels of cannabis in their bloodstream. So he uncovered the fact that some people aren't making enough cannabis in their own body. And so the hypothesis is that, well, maybe the reason why you have irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, or chronic migraines is because of this lack of production of endogenous cannabinoids. So if you supplement the body with CBD or THC, theoretically you would boost this level, and then you could get medicinal benefits. So there's a scientific explanation that would show that cannabis could help fibromyalgia. Now, in my experience, I probably have about 500 fibromyalgia patients. Cannabis sometimes is almost like a fibromyalgia specialty clinic to an extent. And the majority of them do feel better. Fibromyalgia is complicated. Some people experience it very differently. Again, it's a disease with a huge spectrum. So some people can't sleep, some people have anxiety, some people have mood disorders, some people have chronic nerve pain, some people have chronic inflammation, some people have associated IBS or migraines. So everybody falls differently on that spectrum when it comes to fibromyalgia, but we can target different symptoms with cannabis to optimize quality of life. And in my experience, it's very effective.
Okay, we got time for two more. We got one here.
My question is, CBD oil, is it generally derived from whole plant or one plant, or is it, I don't understand what that is all about.
Okay. So when manufacturing cannabis oil, you will obtain a large quantity of cannabis, and it will be ground and then extracted with either CO2 or a solvent. Depending on the initial composition of the plant material, so you'll either be extracting a high THC strain or a 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio, or a high CBD strain. With oils, it's easy to combine the two to make different ratios, but it really depends on the plant material you're starting with and what your end use of it is.
This is going to be the last one. Here we are.
Maybe it's a good thing I'm last because it's an answer, not a question. But, well, two things. I'd be curious to know how many people here are already using CBD oil. And my other comment is, I go to a clinic that's near Chinook Center, north in the little strip mall called Natural Health, and there's a doctor there, and she or he will run you through your symptoms and diagnosis and approval, give you approval, and then the company actually orders your CBD oil from one of you people, I think. So that's the way to go. To answer somebody's question over here, there is a clinic in Calgary that's quite close to where I live, I guess, in the southwest.
Well, that is one thing. Okay, how many people here are doing cannabis right now, or within the last few days, say? So it's only about 5%. So I think, okay, well, that's good to know. All right, we're out of time here, and I want to, first of all, to thank our great speakers. You guys were terrific. Thank you again. Thank you so much. That's great information. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And I'm not sure what we're going to be doing next, but I'll definitely make sure you find out. So thank you very much.